Long before European gunboats appeared on African shores, the continent was already home to advanced spiritual systems that served not only religious but also strategic military functions. At the heart of these systems was Juju, a broad term used to describe spiritual forces, magical objects, charms, rituals, and practitioners who wielded influence over health, fate, fertility, protection, and warfare. These spiritual traditions varied from the Ifa divinations of the Yoruba, to the Nkisi powers of the Congo, and the rain-making rituals of the Zulu. Though often dismissed by outsiders as superstition, these practices were built on complex cosmologies that linked the visible world to the spiritual realm in profoundly political and militaristic ways. In African thought, war was not merely a physical struggle, it was a spiritual disruption that required preparation on multiple planes. Before warriors set foot on a battlefield, chiefs and diviners consulted oracles, performed blood sacrifices, and invoked ancestral spirits to determine favorable days for attack. Weapons were often consecrated with sacred herbs, animal blood, or invocations to deities like Ogun, the god of iron and war. Warriors wore amulets and charms, not just as symbols of courage, but as active agents believed to make them invisible, bulletproof, or psychologically terrifying to the enemy. The belief in spiritual invincibility played a critical role in rallying troops, especially in societies where military strength was not centralized in standing armies but spread across warrior classes, age-grade systems, and hunter guilds. Juju rituals also included psychological warfare, from magical symbols etched on enemy paths to curses pronounced by priestesses that promised illness or madness to foes. The battlefield became a sacred space where spiritual and physical forces collided. Interestingly, spiritual warfare was not only reactive but also preemptive. Tribes used divination to anticipate invasions and preempt conflict through targeted spiritual manipulation, dream disruptions, food poisoning rituals, or summoning storms to halt enemy progress. Such capabilities were seen as legitimate extensions of statecraft. In some societies, like the Dahomey Kingdom, entire military units operated under the direction of spiritual generals who were trained in both combat and esoterica. But as Africa's spiritual systems grew more sophisticated, they also became entangled in political struggles and manipulations. Kings and generals began to rely on Juju not just for defense but to assert divine legitimacy over rivals, creating a volatile fusion of religion and realpolitik. Before the arrival of European empires, the seeds of spiritual militarization had already taken root, ready to either resist or collapse in the face of foreign gunpowder. The stage was set for a new kind of war, one where bullets met blessings. In many African societies, the distinction between warrior and mystic was deliberately blurred. The art of warfare was as much about invoking the unseen as it was about mastering the sword or spear. From the Asante Empire to the Kingdom of Benin, military campaigns were intricately planned with spiritual advisors embedded in war councils. These priest-warriors, diviners, and fetish priests were not background figures, they were central actors who dictated the timing of attacks, selected battle sites, and prepared warriors through elaborate rituals that fused strategy with ceremony. In the Asante Empire, present-day Ghana, for instance, warriors were armed not only with muskets and cutlasses but also with specially prepared amulets called suman. These charms were believed to deflect bullets, repel enemies, and ensure safe return. The process of making a suman could take weeks and involved secret chants, herbal mixtures, animal parts, and even human blood in extreme cases. Once completed, these objects were fed regularly to maintain their potency, turning the bearer into a living extension of spiritual energy. Victory was never seen as purely tactical, it was evidence that the gods and ancestors had favored one side over the other. Among the Yoruba, powerful war chiefs like Ara Onakakanfo were expected to be both military tacticians and spiritual figures. They would consult Ifa oracles before any campaign, asking for divine guidance on battle routes, enemy weaknesses, and the spiritual vulnerabilities of rival leaders. Sacred forests were used for ritual purification, while warriors might be secluded in shrines to undergo fortification. Spiritual conditioning meant to increase bravery, dull pain, and align the fighter's spirit with those of warrior deities like Ogun. This spiritual conditioning was psychological warfare, but it was also a deeply internalized belief system that boosted resilience in the face of death. In the kingdom of Dahomey, women warriors known as the Mino, often referred to as the Dahomey Amazons, underwent intense spiritual training alongside physical drills. Before going to war, they visited temples where priestesses invoked spirits to bless their weapons and imbue them with supernatural efficacy. The Mino were also known to wear talismans on their chests, wrists, and ankles, each charged with a specific spell. These practices weren't mere ornamentation, they reflected an understanding of war as a cosmic engagement that demanded harmony between body, weapon, and spirit. But spiritual empowerment had its risks. Over-reliance on Juju could lead to strategic missteps, especially when charm-induced confidence crossed into recklessness. Armies sometimes charged into gunfire believing themselves bulletproof, only to suffer devastating losses when their magic failed or was outmatched by enemy technology. Still, to dismiss Juju as mere fantasy would be a mistake. It was a cultural technology, one that offered social cohesion. The arrival of European colonial powers in Africa in the 15th to 19th centuries introduced a seismic shift in warfare. Gunpowder, cannons, and disciplined standing armies clashed with traditional African forces steeped in spiritual warfare. While many African societies initially incorporated firearms into their military arsenals, the deeper collision was ideological. Western warfare emphasized material dominance and linear battle strategies, while African resistance leaned on spiritual legitimacy, guerrilla tactics, and ancestral authority. This ideological mismatch created some of the most fascinating and tragic battlefields in history. Take the Itsekiri and Benin kingdoms, for example, which had access to firearms via trade with the Portuguese as early as the 16th century. While muskets were introduced, their spiritual significance often rivaled their tactical role. Guns themselves were sometimes consecrated like charms, seen not as superior technology but as enhanced instruments of Juju when spiritually activated. In some cases, African warriors believed that the spirit of the gun had to be awakened for it to work effectively. This fusion of technology and spirituality became a double-edged sword, providing psychological comfort, but sometimes distorting strategic reality. As colonial conquests accelerated in the 19th century, the power imbalance grew. European armies, often dismissive of local belief systems, brought Maxim guns, artillery, and scorched earth policies. African defenders, like those under Samori Touré in West Africa or the Xhosa during the cattle-killing movement, continued to rely heavily on ritual protections, oracles, and spirit mediums. In the famous Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, Zulu warriors fought valiantly with spears and spiritual rituals against British firepower. Despite early victories like the Battle of Isandlwana, spiritual invincibility could not withstand sustained barrages of industrial weaponry. Perhaps the most tragic illustration of this clash occurred during the Maji Maji Rebellion, 1905 to 1907, in German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania. A spirit medium named Kinjekitile Ngwale claimed to have received a divine message that war medicine, a sacred liquid known as Maji, would protect warriors from German bullets. Thousands of fighters anointed themselves with the water and went to battle with confidence. But the bullets did not stop. The rebellion was crushed with brutal efficiency, leaving over 250,000 Africans dead. Still, the spiritual power of the rebellion echoed for generations, transforming Maji Maji into a symbol of resistance, even in defeat. These spiritual confrontations with industrial militarism were not mere acts of naivete. Rather, they were the culmination of centuries-old systems being forced to adapt under pressure. In some cases, spiritual warfare galvanized communities and prolonged resistance where military resources were thin. In others, it led to catastrophic misjudgments. What emerges from this history is not a binary of reason versus superstition, but a tragic collision of worldviews, one mechanized, the other metaphysical, each convinced of its invincibility. In the end, it was not just bullets that pierced African defenses, it was a deeper cultural dislocation that rewrote the rules of war. As the colonial grip tightened across Africa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the role of Juju in warfare evolved from traditional military practice into a full-fledged tool of political resistance. It wasn't merely about protecting warriors anymore, it became a symbol of defiance, unity, and cultural survival. In the face of technological inferiority and political fragmentation, Juju gave African resistance movements a spiritual anchor. The leaders of these uprisings, many of them shamans, priest-kings, or spirit mediums, rallied communities through visions, prophecies, and magical demonstrations, transforming abstract anti-colonial sentiments into actionable revolts. One of the most compelling examples is the story of Nhanda Charwe Nyakasikana, a spirit medium of the Shona people in present-day Zimbabwe. She was believed to be possessed by the ancestral spirit Nhanda and played a central role in organizing the first Kimurenga rebellion against British settlers in 1896. Nhanda declared the rebellion to be spiritually sanctioned, urging warriors to fight for the land and ancestors. Though she was eventually captured and executed by the British, her last words, "My bones shall rise again," became a prophetic symbol of Zimbabwe's eventual liberation. For her followers, Juju wasn't folklore, it was national destiny. Similarly, in British Nigeria, the Ekumeku movement in the Anioma region used secret societies and spiritual rituals to wage guerrilla war against colonial forces for nearly 30 years, 1883 to 1914. The Ekumeku warriors operated under the protection of powerful charms and followed the directives of diviners who interpreted dreams and omens. Their tactics baffled colonial administrators, messages were encoded through symbolic cloths, battle plans were whispered by masked dancers in forest groves, and resistance was sustained through oaths sworn upon ancestral altars. Juju was the glue that held an underground rebellion together, even when firepower was lacking. The Mau Mau Uprising, 1952 to 1960, in Kenya added another layer to this spiritual warfare. Fighters took oaths known as Muma, binding themselves spiritually to the cause of liberation. These rituals were intense, involving animal sacrifices, symbolic markings, and invocations of Kikuyu ancestors. Colonial officers feared these oaths so deeply that they equated them with terrorism, banning their practice and imprisoning anyone found to have taken them. Yet the Mau Mau's spiritual commitment made them resilient. Many would rather die than break their oath. Juju here was more than protection, it was psychological armor against fear and betrayal. These icons of resistance prove that spiritual warfare did not disappear with muskets or colonization, it adapted. Juju became a defiant counter-narrative to colonial attempts at cultural erasure. It provided not just strategic tools but emotional and philosophical foundations for armed struggle. Even when crushed militarily, movements infused with Juju often left behind enduring legends, symbols, and heroes who inspired future generations. In the anti-colonial era, Juju transitioned from battlefield tactic to spiritual insurgency, etching itself into the very soul of African liberation. Juju's involvement in African warfare has always stirred deep controversy, both within African societies and in the eyes of outsiders. While many communities revered Juju as a legitimate form of spiritual protection and empowerment, others viewed it with suspicion, fear, or outright hostility. For some, Juju was sacred, for others, it was sorcery, manipulation, or even a means of control. The line between spiritual empowerment and spiritual coercion was often blurred, especially in wartime. This duality has sparked centuries of debate about whether Juju was a force of liberation or oppression. Colonial powers deliberately weaponized these controversies to discredit African resistance. European missionaries and administrators often lumped all indigenous spiritual practices under the term witchcraft, a label used to justify violent crackdowns on any form of organized spiritual resistance. Rituals were outlawed, shrines were destroyed, and traditional priests were imprisoned or executed. But this vilification was not purely moral, it was deeply political. By casting Juju as dangerous and irrational, colonial regimes could delegitimize movements rooted in cultural identity and spiritual sovereignty, presenting European religion and science as the only path to civilization. However, the fear of Juju was not limited to colonizers. Within African communities themselves, the power of spiritual warfare often created internal tensions. Warriors believed to be invincible could inspire awe, but also jealousy, paranoia, and betrayal. Ritual leaders sometimes demanded absolute obedience, threatening curses or divine punishment against dissenters. In prolonged conflicts, the use of Juju could shift from defense to domination. There are historical cases of leaders abusing spiritual authority to settle personal vendettas, enforce rigid hierarchies, or exploit followers through fear. When mixed with political ambition, Juju's spiritual legitimacy could be dangerously distorted. Moreover, not all spiritual protections worked, or were believed to work. Failed battles led to growing skepticism, and communities were forced to confront difficult questions. Had the rituals been done incorrectly? Had the gods turned their backs? Were the charms fake? In the Maji Maji Rebellion, for example, the shattering of faith in the bulletproof water led to spiritual crises as well as military defeat. Betrayals and disappointments bred disillusionment, and in some regions, traditional spiritual leaders lost their status. The very faith that had once united communities could, under certain conditions, fracture them. Yet despite these complexities, the enduring power of Juju lies in its ability to tap into collective belief. Whether seen as truth or illusion, it has historically held the power to mobilize, to inspire, and to terrify. Juju was never just about magic, it was about meaning. In times of war, it served as a moral compass, a source of courage, and a form of justice. But like any powerful force, it could also be corrupted, misunderstood, or feared. The debates surrounding Juju warfare are not only about the past, they reflect enduring questions about power, faith, and the ethics of belief in a world still grappling with spiritual identity. With the dawn of independence in the mid-20th century, many African nations turned away from traditional systems like Juju in favor of modern statecraft, military professionalism, and imported ideologies. Yet, despite the new political structures, Juju never fully disappeared, it simply changed form. In post-colonial conflicts, especially civil wars and insurgencies, remnants of spiritual warfare continued to surface. Juju evolved from a state-sanctioned wartime tool to a more fragmented, underground force, present in militias, rebel groups, and local defense units. Its presence, though less centralized, remained potent and deeply embedded in regional memory. Liberia and Sierra Leone's brutal civil wars in the 1990s reignited global awareness of spiritual warfare. Fighters, many of them child soldiers, were reported to undergo ritual fortification, wear amulets, and consult spirit mediums before battle. In some units, commanders claimed to be possessed by ancestral spirits, while others relied on local herbalists to concoct charms that supposedly rendered them invisible or bulletproof. These spiritual practices were sometimes amplified by drug use and extreme violence, leading international observers to dismiss them as delusion or madness. Yet for the fighters themselves, Juju offered psychological power in an environment where death was random and authority collapsed. The paradox of Juju in modern warfare lies in its dual legacy. It has been both a source of spiritual resilience and a tool exploited by warlords to manipulate fear. In Nigeria, for example, some regional vigilante groups and criminal cults still employ Juju rituals to command loyalty and instill dread. Members often swear oaths involving blood or sacred objects, creating unbreakable psychological bonds. This reflects an enduring cultural memory, where the spiritual is inseparable from the political and martial spheres. However, these modern iterations often lack the communal ethics that once balanced power with responsibility in pre-colonial societies. On the other hand, many African governments, seeking international legitimacy, have distanced themselves from traditional spiritual systems. Military academies are modeled on Western structures, and national identities are often forged through secular or religiously monolithic narratives. Juju has been relegated to the fringes, discussed in whispers, practiced in secret, or preserved only in folklore and ritual art. Still, among elders, rural communities, and traditionalist circles, stories of the magic wars endure. These tales are passed down not only as myth but as counter-histories that challenge the dominant, colonial-informed narratives of Africa's military past. The legacy of Juju in African warfare is thus one of both loss and persistence. While state institutions may have sidelined it, the spiritual logic of warfare continues to shape perceptions of power, courage, justice, and fate. For many, Juju remains a symbol of resistance, identity, and a deeper connection to the ancestral world. Whether feared, revered, or forgotten, it lingers in the cracks of memory, reminding the continent that wars were never fought on just one plane, they were waged in both the visible and the invisible realms. As Africa enters the 21st century, the role of Juju in warfare is experiencing a subtle yet profound resurgence. In many countries, the tensions between modernity and tradition have led to a re-evaluation of spiritual systems, including Juju. While military technologies continue to advance and foreign military aid pours in, there is a growing recognition of the need to harness indigenous belief systems to foster unity, resilience, and identity. From the Boko Haram insurgency in northern Nigeria to the armed conflicts in the Central African Republic, it seems that Juju, though not always in its historical form, is still a key part of the region's contemporary warfare. One of the most striking ways Juju has returned is through its use by militant groups, who tap into indigenous spiritual practices to assert power over local populations. In some conflict zones, armed groups use ritualistic practices to bind their fighters together, creating a sense of collective purpose and invulnerability. The belief in spiritual protection or divine favor can bolster morale and increase loyalty among troops, particularly when faced with overwhelming odds. These practices have made their way into modern guerrilla warfare, where the element of surprise and psychological warfare are as important as physical force. Groups like Boko Haram, for example, use sacred oaths, ritual initiations, and charms to enforce discipline and control among their ranks. At the same time, African governments are increasingly recognizing the importance of indigenous spirituality as a way to bridge the gap between state and society. In countries like Ghana, South Africa, and Kenya, there is a growing interest in reasserting cultural heritage as part of national identity building. This has included the rehabilitation of traditional healing and spiritual practices, including Juju, in the context of nation building and peace building. Juju, in these settings, is often reframed not just as a tool of war but as a repository of collective wisdom, healing, and resilience. This transformation of Juju from a tool of battle to one of cultural pride speaks to a larger movement toward reclaiming indigenous traditions in the post-colonial era. In the context of peace and reconciliation, Juju holds a fascinating potential. Many African societies have historically used spiritual leaders to mediate conflicts and restore balance after wars or disputes. The concept of spiritual justice is rooted in these traditions, where rituals of forgiveness, cleansing, and reconciliation take precedence over vengeance. Some modern peace initiatives have even incorporated these rituals to help heal communities torn apart by civil wars or ethnic violence. As Africa continues to grapple with its post-colonial identity, Juju may find a new role in reconciling the past with the present, providing a spiritual avenue for healing as well as defense. However, the return of Juju in Africa's future wars raises important questions about the ethics and implications of spiritual warfare in a modern context. As religious, political, and cultural boundaries blur, the practice of Juju can be easily manipulated by extremists or warlords seeking to legitimize violence. The line between protecting a community's cultural heritage and exploiting superstition for power becomes increasingly difficult to discern. Furthermore, the resurgence of Juju may lead to a paradoxical situation where the continent's history of magical realism in warfare is both a source of pride and a tool of fear. How will African societies balance their rich spiritual traditions with the need for a more secular, stable, and democratic future? The future of Juju in African warfare is thus uncertain. Will it remain a powerful symbol of resistance and resilience, or will it become a tool of coercion and manipulation? What is clear is that Juju is not a relic of the past. It is alive, evolving, and intertwined with the fabric of African identity. In a continent where wars continue to be fought not only with guns but with ideologies, Juju remains a potent reminder that the spiritual realm and the physical world are often inseparable. Whether on the battlefield or in the halls of power, Juju's influence will continue to shape Africa's wars and the very nature of its struggles for freedom, justice, and self-determination. From sacred charms to the thunder of muskets, Africa's warriors once stood armed with both spirit and steel. Juju empowered hearts, while gunpowder shook empires, together forging legends of defiance and destiny. In every chant and every shot, echoes of resistance still whisper through the continent's soil. If this journey moved you, like, comment, share, and subscribe for more untold African histories.